The sweet scent of Willamette Valley soil had been replaced by the acrid sting of bankruptcy, while neighboring megafarms drowned their fields in thousands of dollars of toxic chemical death to eradicate an unstoppable superweed. Maeve Gallagher gambled her family's century-old legacy on 150 hungry, horned outcasts. The Gallagher farm had survived the Great Depression, 2 devastating floods, and a century of unpredictable Oregon winters. But as Maeve Gallagher stood at the edge of the northern 40 acres, she knew they might not survive her older brother's desperation. The soil beneath her boots, usually a rich, loamy espresso color, was baked into a brittle ashen crust. Crumbled leaves of what should have been their most lucrative cash crop heirloom, sugar pumpkins and specialty winter wheat, littered the ground like the aftermath of a wildfire. But there had been no fire. The devastation was entirely man-made, delivered from the pressurized nozzles of a crop duster just 3 days ago. "You don't understand, Maeve." Liam had pleaded a week prior, his eyes bloodshot and sunken from nights spent, agonizing over ledgers that bled red ink. "The amaranth is choking everything. It's mutating. Standard herbicides aren't even touching it anymore. If we don't get a clear harvest this autumn, the bank is pulling the pin. We lose the house. We lose the land. We lose Dad's legacy." The enemy was Palmer amaranth, specifically a hyper-aggressive iron-rooted variant that had swept through the valley like a botanical plague. It grew inches a day, siphoning water and nutrients with ruthless efficiency, dwarfing their crops and destroying the harvesters with stalks as thick as baseball bats. To save the farm, Liam had turned to Harrison Croft. Croft was a man whose tailored Italian suits looked aggressively out of place against the backdrop of tractors and silos. He owned Croft AgriCorp, a sprawling corporate farming conglomerate that had been swallowing up independent family farms across the county for a decade. Croft always seemed to appear when a family was at their lowest, offering a smiling face and a poisoned chalice. Behind Maeve's back, Liam had signed a contract with Croft for the immediate application of Aegis 7, a highly potent proprietary herbicide still in its aggressive trial phases. It was incredibly expensive, $18,000 they didn't have, but Croft had generously offered to finance the chemical application himself. All Liam had to do was put up the deed to the Gallagher's pristine, southern 40 acres as collateral. It was a guaranteed fix Croft had promised. The chemical was designed to target the amaranth's specific protein synthesis, leaving the heirloom crops perfectly intact. It was a lie. Maeve knelt in the dirt, crumbling a scorched pumpkin vine between her calloused fingers. The Aegis 7 hadn't just killed the pigweed. It had sterilized the topsoil, essentially creating a scorched earth zone where not a single living organism could survive. The wheat was blackened. The pumpkin vines were shriveled husks. $18,000 worth of chemical salvation had just annihilated 60% of their annual income in an afternoon. He knew, Maeve whispered to the empty, silent field. He knew it would do this. Footsteps crunched on the dead earth behind her. It was Tobias, the 60-year-old farmhand, who had worked for their father since Maeve was in pigtails. His weathered face was grim under the brim of his faded cap. Liam's locked himself in the barn office, Tobias said, his voice gravelly, with suppressed anger. He got off the phone with the bank. Word travels fast. Croft already filed the preliminary paperwork to trigger the default clause on the loan. He expects us to miss the harvest quota. Once we do, the southern 40 is his. Maeve stood up, brushing the toxic dust from her jeans. The pieces of Croft's puzzle snapped together with sickening clarity. Croft didn't care about selling chemicals. He used the exorbitant cost of the Aegis 7 to force farmers into putting up land as collateral, knowing full well the chemical was too harsh for specialty crops. He was systematically poisoning his neighbors to legally steal their acreage, and the Gallagher farm, sitting directly over the county's largest natural aquifer, was his crown jewel. "He wants the water rights," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy calm. "If he gets the southern 40, he controls the creek access. The rest of our land dries up in 2 years, and he buys the house for pennies on the dollar." "We still have the southern acreage," Tobias pointed out, pointing toward the rolling green hills in the distance. 40 acres of organic soy and alfalfa. It's untouched by the spray." "But it's infested," Maeve countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. And it was. From where they stood, Maeve could see the towering, dense green walls of amaranth choking the southern fields. The weeds were already 6 feet tall in some places, forming an impenetrable jungle. If they couldn't clear the weeds, the combine harvesters would jam, the crop would rot in the field, and they wouldn't make the yield required to pay off Croft's predatory loan. They had exactly 45 days until harvest. "If we spray the South Crofts, chemicals will kill the alfalfa." Maeve thought aloud, her mind racing. "If we send crews in to hand-pull it, it will take months and cost a fortune we don't have. Tractors can't get through stalks that thick without ruining the crop underneath." "We're boxed in, kid," Tobias sighed, taking off his hat and wiping his brow. "Your brother made a deal with the devil, and the devil always collects." Maeve stared at the towering invasive weeds in the distance. A fierce, inherited stubbornness, the same grit that had kept her ancestors alive through famine and storm, ignited in her chest. Harrison Croft thought he was playing chess against simple country hicks. He thought he had outsmarted them with corporate contracts and lab-engineered poison. "No," Maeve said, turning on her heel and marching toward her beat-up Ford pickup. "He doesn't get to win. Not today." "Where are you going?" Tobias called out. "To find a different kind of monster to fight his." Maeve yelled back, throwing the truck into gear and kicking up a cloud of dust as she tore down the driveway. An absurd, desperate memory from an old agricultural textbook had just surfaced in her mind. If machines couldn't clear the field and chemicals would destroy it, she needed a biological weapon. She needed an army. 2 towns over, sitting in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, lay a dilapidated ranch owned by a man named Gideon Fletcher. Gideon was a stubborn, eccentric rancher who had tried to corner the market on artisanal meat, only to be crushed by the same supply chain issues squeezing the rest of the valley. When Maeve's truck rattled to a halt outside Gideon's rusted gates, the air was thick with the smell of dust and musk. Behind a series of heavy-duty chain-link fences paced an absolute sea of goats. They weren't the small, docile, petting zoo creatures people usually imagined. These were Boer and Spanish crossbreeds, massive, thick-necked, heavy-horned animals, built for survival in harsh scrublands. They were aggressive foragers with stomachs practically lined with cast iron. Gideon stepped out onto his porch, eyeing Maeve with suspicion. "We're closed, Gallagher. I'm selling the herd to a dog food processing plant in Idaho next week. Banks foreclosing." "I don't want to buy meat." "Gideon," Maeve said, leaning against the fence, as a massive black-spotted buck approached the wire, sizing her up with horizontal alien-like pupils. "I want to rent them. All of them." Gideon scoffed, leaning over his porch railing. "Rent 150 Spanish crosses." "What for lawn ornaments?" "I need them to eat Parma amaranth," Maeve said plainly. "I've got 40 acres of it choking out my alfalfa. The stalks are thick as tree branches, and the weeds are going to seed in a month." Gideon laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You're crazy. Amaranth is toxic to cattle and horses. It builds up nitrates. It'll poison them." "It poisons cattle," Maeve corrected him, taking a step closer. "But goats are browsers, not grazers. Their livers produce enzymes that can break down the toxins in amaranth bindweeds and thistles. They evolved to eat garbage vegetation that would kill a cow. And they don't just eat the leaves, Gideon. They strip the bark, they eat the seed heads, and their digestive tracts completely destroy the weed seeds so they don't germinate in their manure. Gideon stared at her, the laughter dying in his throat. Even if they could eat it without dropping dead, you got an alfalfa crop underneath. Goats aren't picky. They'll eat your cash crop right along with the weeds. No, they won't, Maeve said, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Alfalfa is low to the ground. Spanish goats naturally browse upward. They prefer broadleaf weeds, brush, and high foliage over ground-level legumes. If I stock them densely enough mob grazing, they'll strip the towering amaranth first, because it's at their eye level. Once the weeds are decimated, I pull the herd before they start looking down at the alfalfa. Gideon rubbed his jaw. It's a hell of a gamble, Maeve. If your timing is off by even 48 hours, they'll scalp your fields to the dirt. I don't have a choice, Maeve said, pulling a worn leather pouch from her pocket. She dumped the contents onto Gideon's porch table. It was a collection of thick gold bonds, her mother's vintage diamond wedding ring, and the pink slip to her Ford pickup. This is everything I own in the world. It's worth about $12,000. I need your herd, your portable electric fencing, and your stock trailers for 30 days. Gideon looked at the desperate young woman, then down at the ring, and finally out at his herd animals he had raised by hand, destined for a slaughterhouse. He slowly slid the pink slip back toward her. Keep the truck. You'll need it to haul water. I'll take the bonds and the ring as a deposit. But if they die of nitrate poisoning, you're buying the corpses. 48 hours later, the Gallagher farm sounded like a battlefield. Liam stood on the back porch, his face pale with a mixture of horror and fury, as 3 massive double-decker livestock trailers roared up the dirt driveway. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of bleats, stomps, and the rattling of metal. "What have you done?" Liam screamed over the din storming out into the yard, as Maeve and Tobias began unrolling spools of bright white electrified polywire fencing across the perimeter of the southern 40. "Saving your ass, Liam," Maeve shouted back, slamming a fiberglass fence post into the ground with a mallet. The Aegis 7 was a setup. Croft wanted the crops to die, so he could take the deed. Liam froze, the colour draining entirely from his face. No. The rep said it was safe for squash. The rep lied. Maeve snapped, securing the wire. "We have 1 untouched field left. The tractors can't clear the amaranth, so we are going to eat it." Before Liam could protest further, a sleek black Mercedes SUV rolled down the driveway, parking a safe distance from the muddy trailers. Harrison Croft stepped out, wearing a bemused, arrogant smirk. He had come to gloat undoubtedly, checking in to see if Liam had cracked under the pressure of the dying northern fields. Well, Croft said, smoothly, adjusting his cuffs as he surveyed the chaotic scene. "Bringing in livestock. Liam trying to pivot to dairy. I must warn you, the bank requires notification if you are altering the fundamental business model of the acreage held in collateral." Maeve marched right up to the property line, stopping mere inches from Croft. "We aren't pivoting to dairy, Harrison. We're clearing the field you tried to steal." Croft let out a condescending chuckle, looking at the massive bearded goats peering aggressively through the trailer slats. "With those, my dear girl, you are out of your depth. Parma amaranth is virtually indestructible. Those filthy animals are either going to die of nitrate toxicity, or they're going to eat whatever pitiful alfalfa you have left out there. Either way, that deed will be sitting on my desk by October 1st. We'll see about that," Maeve said, her eyes flashing with defiance. She turned to Gideon, who was standing by the trailer latches. "Let 'em loose, Gideon." Gideon threw the heavy steel latches and swung the ramp doors down. For a moment, nothing happened. The heavy, oppressive silence of the summer afternoon hung over the farm. Then, a massive, horned herd sire stepped down the ramp. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching. Behind him, 149 goats surged forward, pouring out of the trailers like a relentless furry flood. They hit the edge of the southern 40 acres, hitting the towering wall of 10-foot-tall Parma amaranth. Maeve held her breath. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the fence post. Tobias stood completely still. Liam buried his face in his hands, unable to watch. Even Croft dropped his smirk. His eyes narrowed as he watched the herd fan out into the thicket. The goats stood in the field surrounded by the lush, low-lying green of the lucrative alfalfa crop and the thick, tree-like stalks of the invasive weeds. The lead buck lowered his head. He sniffed a patch of delicate alfalfa. Maeve's heart stopped. If he took a bite, the rest of the herd would follow, and the farm was finished. Instead, the buck sneezed, lifted his massive head, and snapped his jaws around the thick, fibrous stem of a towering amaranth plant. With a violent jerk of his neck, he stripped a massive branch of leaves and seed pods directly off the weed, chewing loudly. Instantly, the rest of the herd followed suit. The field erupted into a frenzy of crunching, snapping, and tearing. They ignored the ground-level alfalfa, entirely rearing up on their hind legs to reach the highest, thickest leaves of the weeds. They were a swarm of locusts, with horns systematically devouring the indestructible superweed with ruthless biological efficiency. Maeve let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days. She turned to look at Harrison Croft. The corporate titan wasn't smiling anymore. The color had vanished from his perfectly tanned face as he watched the unbeatable lab-resistant weeds being devoured at a terrifying pace. "You have until October 1st. Croft." Maeve said, her voice ringing out clear and victorious over the sound of the feasting herd. "Get off my land." For 14 agonizing, blistering days, the Gallagher farm operated under a tense, fragile truce with nature. The Boer Spanish crossbreeds proved to be the ultimate biological machines. They chewed through the towering, mutated Parma amaranth with a ferocious, unyielding hunger. Maeve Tobias and an increasingly humbled Liam worked in grueling 12-hour shifts, manually moving the electric polywire fences to create concentrated grazing zones. This mob grazing tactic forced the herd to clear one section completely before moving to the next. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The thick, impenetrable jungle of toxic weeds that had threatened to choke the life out of their final cash crop was rapidly dissolving into bare, chewed-up stalks, and true to Maeve's desperate theory, the delicate, low-lying alfalfa remained completely untouched. The goats, driven by their natural browsing instincts, kept their heads high, devouring the broad leaves and seed heads of the amaranth, while ignoring the lucrative legumes under their hooves. But as the green walls fell, revealing the healthy alfalfa waiting beneath, the desperation in the valley began to shift from the Gallagher family to Croft Agricorp. Harrison Croft was not a man who accepted defeat. He had built his empire by ruthlessly crushing independent operations, exploiting loopholes and manipulating despair. The sight of a ragtag herd of rented livestock undoing his meticulously orchestrated hostile takeover was a humiliation he could not swallow. He had promised his investors the Gallagher Aquifer. He had already drafted the blueprints for a massive automated irrigation hub on the southern 40. If nature could not destroy the Gallaghers, Croft decided he would have to give nature a helping hand. The attack came on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday night, just 10 days before the harvest deadline. Maeve was sleeping in the cab of her battered Ford truck, parked on the ridge overlooking the southern fields. She had taken to sleeping out there, armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a thermos of black coffee, gripped by a paranoid but justified fear that Croft would retaliate. At 2 a.m., the low, unnatural hum of an ATV engine broke the silence of the valley. Maeve jolted awake, her pulse hammering in her ears. She grabbed her binoculars, scanning the perimeter of the electrified polywire. At first, she saw nothing but the shadowy shapes of the sleeping herd. Then, a sharp metallic snap echoed across the silent acreage, followed immediately by the terrifying, chaotic sound of panicked bleating. Someone had cut the fence. Maeve slammed her hand on the truck's horn, the blaring noise echoing off the hills like a siren, and threw the vehicle into gear. She tore down the ridge, the headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a scene of absolute sabotage. A masked figure on an ATV was aggressively herding the terrified goats out of the safe southern 40, driving them relentlessly toward the desolate, chemical-scorched earth of the northern fields. It was a calculated lethal maneuver. The northern topsoil was still saturated with the highly toxic Aegis 7 herbicide. If the goats, already stressed and hungry, began foraging on the chemically soaked dead vines in the dark, the concentrated poison would cause massive liver failure. The entire herd would be dead by sunrise. Gideon would be ruined, the farm would lose its biological defense, and Croft would secure his victory. Tobias Liam. Maeve screamed out the window, praying they had heard the horn. She floored the accelerator, aiming the heavy steel bumper of the Ford directly at the trespassing ATV. The trespasser turned, blinded by her high beams, and panicked. He swerved violently to avoid the incoming truck losing control in the loose, dry dirt. The ATV flipped, throwing the rider into a shallow irrigation ditch. Maeve slammed on the brakes, leaping out of the cab with a heavy tire iron gripped tightly in her hands. By the time she reached the ditch, the man was groaning, clutching a broken collarbone. She recognized him instantly. It was Boyd Higgins, a notorious local contractor who exclusively handled Croft's under-the-table evictions and intimidation tactics. "You tell Harrison." Maeve breathed heavily, standing over Boyd with absolute fury radiating from her trembling frame, "that if he ever sends someone onto my land again, I won't use the brakes next time." In the distance, the roar of Liam's tractor approaching signaled that reinforcements had arrived. Together, working frantically under the beam of the tractor lights, Maeve, Liam, and Tobias managed to block the goats from crossing into the poison zone, painstakingly herding them back into the safe pasture and hastily repairing the severed wire. The sabotage attempt had failed, but it solidified one absolute truth: Croft was terrified. The harvest was secure, and he knew it. Dawn broke on the morning of September 28th, painting the Willamette Valley in brilliant strokes of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying the unmistakable earthy scent of harvest season. For the Gallagher family, it was a morning of resurrection. The southern 40 acres, once a towering nightmare of Palmer amaranth, lay perfectly exposed. The goats had done their job with terrifying perfection. Every single invasive stalk had been stripped, snapped, and devoured. What remained was a vast, uninterrupted ocean of brilliant green alfalfa, thick, healthy, and ready for the massive blades of the combine harvesters. But the goats had delivered an unexpected secondary miracle. As Liam and Tobias fired up the massive green, John Deere combines, the machines rolled smoothly into the fields without a single jam or stutter. The blades sliced through the alfalfa, pulling in a yield that looked impossibly heavy. "Look at the density on this," Liam yelled from the cab of the combine, his voice crackling over the two-way radio, thick with unshed tears of relief. "Maeve, I've never seen it this thick. The protein content is going to be off the charts." Maeve stood at the edge of the field, holding a clipboard, a profound sense of awe washing over her. She realized what had happened. By utilizing mob grazing, the 150 goats hadn't just eaten the weeds. They had aggressively trampled the decaying organic matter into the soil, while simultaneously depositing hundreds of pounds of nitrogen-rich manure. They had inadvertently created a hyper-concentrated organic fertilization cycle over the past month. The alfalfa hadn't just survived the invasion, it had thrived on the biological aftermath, growing stronger and more nutrient-dense than any chemically treated crop in the county. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the storage silos were bursting. The local agricultural co-op inspector arrived taking samples of the yield to grade the quality. When the results came back, the farm erupted into cheers. It was classified as premium grade A organic, commanding a market price 30% higher than standard alfalfa. The financial math, previously a source of suffocating anxiety, suddenly became a beacon of salvation. The yield would not only cover the predatory $18,000 debt owed to Croft Agricorp for the disastrous Aegis 7 spray, but it would also leave them with enough surplus capital to replant the northern 40 and secure Gideon Fletcher's farm from his own impending foreclosure. The reckoning occurred 2 days later, inside the sterile, glass-walled conference room of the Valley's central bank. Harrison Croft sat at the polished mahogany table, a smug, expectant smile plastered across his face. He had his custom fountain pen resting on a stack of foreclosure documents, fully expecting Liam to walk in, broken and defeated, ready to sign over the deed to the aquifer. Instead, the heavy glass doors swung open, and Maeve walked in, followed closely by Liam Gideon and the bank's lead loan officer. Maeve wasn't wearing farm clothes. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, her shoulders squared, her eyes burning with the cold, hard confidence of someone who had stared down ruin and won. "There must be some mistake," Croft said smoothly, though a flicker of unease darted behind his eyes. "The deadline is tomorrow. If you don't have the capital, I need those signatures." Maeve didn't say a word. She calmly reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a certified cashier's check. She slid it across the mahogany table. It came to a stop directly over the foreclosure documents. Croft looked down. The amount on the check covered the debt in full down to the final cent, with a memo line that simply read, "Goat rental and pest control." "The debt is cleared. Harrison!" Maeve said, her voice echoing with commanding authority in the quiet room. "The Southern 40 produced the highest yield this county has seen in a decade. We don't owe you a dime, and you don't own our water." Croft's face contorted, the smug corporate facade crumbling to reveal the furious, humiliated man beneath. "You think you're clever playing in the dirt with livestock? You got lucky, Gallagher. The chemicals were fraudulent," Liam interrupted, slamming a thick manila folder onto the table next to the check. "We had an independent soil agronomist test the Northern 40. Aegis 7 isn't a targeted herbicide. It's an indiscriminate sterilizer. You intentionally sold us a product designed to destroy our primary crop to force a default. And Boyd Higgins, the man you sent to cut our fences, he's currently sitting in the county jail singing like a canary about who paid him to sabotage our livestock." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and deeply satisfying. The loan officer slowly slid the foreclosure documents away from Croft, his expression shifting to one of severe, professional distance. Croft stared at the check, then at the folder, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. Without a word, he snatched his expensive fountain pen, stood up, and stormed out of the conference room, the glass doors slamming violently behind him. Maeve exhaled a long, shaky breath, carrying weeks of terror exhaustion, and finally absolute triumph. She turned to Gideon, who was grinning through his thick grey beard. "Well," Gideon chuckled, tipping his imaginary hat to her, "I guess I better go tell the boys they're officially off the dog food market. They've got a permanent job." The Gallagher farm didn't just survive, it evolved. They abandoned the destructive cycle of chemical warfare against the earth, embracing the chaotic, brilliant efficiency of nature. The legacy remained intact, fiercely guarded by a family that refused to break, and a heavily horned herd that was always hungry for a fight. If this incredible story of resilience, biological warfare, and outsmarting corporate greed inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves seeing the underdog win against all odds. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the fascinating, dramatic, true stories hidden within the world of agriculture. Let us know in the comments below, would you have trusted the goats? See you in the next one.